This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so good morning everyone and welcome back to a fresh new session on the economics classes. And we were talking about the basics of microeconomics, right? So like we had discussed, right, we would be using the microeconomics. So we will be creating the framework for microeconomics, right? So, so what we are trying to do over here is we are trying to kind of create a framework for so we are trying to create a framework for understanding the basics of microeconomics. Okay. So one of the so what we'll do is we'll start off with a very quick revision of the discussions that we have had, right? And from there, what we'll do is we will cover the next steps. So in the last class, we started laying the foundation on the perfectly competitive markets, right? And we tried identifying the different characteristics of the we started identifying the different characteristics of the perfectly competitive market. So, so we said that there are large number of buyers and that there are large number of sellers. The number of buyers is so large that one single buyer will demand a very small fraction of the overall demand. So this means that the buyer would not be in a position to influence the price by increasing his demand for the good. So similarly, the number of sellers are so large that they cannot influence the price by increasing their production. So one of the important things that we have over here is that we laid out the different characteristics. We laid out the different characteristics of the model, right? So we laid down different characteristics, and we said that there are neither consumers. So we laid out the final characteristics of the perfectly competitive market, and based on that, we started developing our demand and supply theory. So one thing that we saw is that behind the classical demand and the supply theory, the market structure that works is a perfectly competitive market structure. It is a very idealistic market structure which does not allow for any competition to happen, which allows for homogeneous goods and services to be there. And given these assumptions, given these characteristics, the entire demand and the supply curve, so supply theory is kind of formed, right? Now, while talking about demand and supply curve in the last class, we talked about the way it relates the price and the quantity demanded, right? So how is it that the price and the quantity demanded is related? And and each of these, so be it the demand curve or be it the supply curve, right? So be it the demand curve or be it the supply curve, what we could see over there is that there is a relationship between the price and the quantity demanded, and it shows the willingness of the respective economic agent to play, right? So one of the important things that comes out over here is, okay. So we talked about the demand curve and the supply curve and their respective interpretations, right? Also, while we were talking about the demand and the supply curve, one of the important topic that we came across was we talked about the the demand and supply not only from the commodity market perspective, but we also had a discussion from the funds market, right? So what is the demand? What does demand and supply stand for in a funds market? So, so from that perspective, we had this kind of a discussion. Now, the important question that comes out over here is, the important question that comes out from here is, uh, that how would you so how is it that we would go ahead to, to discuss, so how do we take the discussion ahead? So what are the different, so we talked about a factor called the invisible hand, right? In yesterday, in the last discussion, and we said that it is this invisible hand which helps in clearing goods and services. Now, one of the important things that we talk about over here is, so one of the important things that we would kind of talk about here is that how is it that this demand and supply is going to work? So how is it that this demand and supply is kind of going to work uh, in the perfectly competitive market? So what causes the demand and supply to work? How is this equilibrium created and all? So today we will be focusing on the basics of this demand and supply curves, and we'll try to explain different kinds of situations with demand and supply curves, right? Different kind of economic situations. So to understand the power of these graphs or these curves as a tool, we need to understand how is it that this that how is that you can infer about decisions from each of these, right? Then we sort of look into to answer the question that why is it that there is a unique price, right? So what is this invisible hand? So we talk about the processes which engineer this equilibrium to happen. Discussion, we will talk about a few important topics. I mean, not only in today's discussion, but including the discussion today and tomorrow, we will be talking about a few important topics. Number one is a concept called Nash equilibrium. We talk about Nash equilibrium. So we'll talk about the Nash equilibrium. The next thing that we talk about today is something called so as we talk about the invisible hand, we talk about the tannonement process. The tannonement process, right? And the third that we talk about over here is the foundations of the demand and supply curve. So we talk about a simple consumers optimization process and the producers optimization process. The producers optimization process. So these are the three important things that we have, right? We have the Nash equilibrium, we have the Tatarma process, and we have the consumer and producers optimization. And over here, the number fourth is we'll talk about the demand and supply situation. Right, the demand and the supply equations, the equilibriums. So these are the things that we will study. And and all of these topics, even though they seem to be independent of each other, they are actually closely knit within one circle. So first of all, what we'll talk about is we start talking about the basic concept of an equilibrium, which we call a Nash equilibrium. Now, Nash equilibrium is a very well-defined concept of equilibrium in economic literature, and it comes from and it's totally and it's used in game theory, right? So when we talk about the game theoretical aspect in details, we'll talk about Nash in details. But for the time being, let's define Nash equilibrium as an equilibrium. And so this was proposed by the late John Forbes Nash, and this was one of the path-breaking concept of equilibrium, and this actually helped us explain the invisible hand what Adam Smith had actually talked about, right? And it comes from a very specific assumption, you know, it comes from a very specific assumption of the perfectly competitive market. So if you have that assumption in the perfectly competitive market definition, the entire market equilibrium actually follows from there, right? So it is this equilibrium which ensures which ensures the Nash equilibrium at the market level, and hence at the demand supply level as well, right? So let's start let's start by talking about that particular assumption. Now, one of the most important assumptions of a perfectly competitive market is that number one, that the price is exogenously determined, which means that neither the borrowers, neither the consumer nor the producers has any control over the price. So let's say So given that the fact that there are large number of buyers and large number of sellers, and by extending that assumption to the fact that one single buyer will demand a very small fraction of the overall demand, right? So it means that neither the producer nor the sellers can impact the prices by the selling or buying practices. Rather, the price is set as a joint effort of the consumers and the producers. So this is where the exogenous price comes into play, right? So these two assumptions together, yeah, and along with the fact that the goods are homogeneous, leads us to the fact that the price is exogenously determined, right? Now let's say there is now I'm saying that this price is exogenously set by the market, right? So it is neither the consumer nor the producers who has any hold over that, and therefore they are someone who would always accept the price. Now what if that in this market structure there is a rebel, and what he does is he says no, I'm not going to accept this price. What I want to do is I want to set a price. Let's say P star is the equilibrium price, and there is a person who says no, I'm going to charge a price P1, a price P1, which is more than P star. The question is this a sustainable price? The answer is no, because the moment he charges a price more than P star, let's say he charges a price P star plus epsilon, where epsilon is greater than 0. So epsilon shows an infinitesimally small increment over what P star is. So epsilon P star plus epsilon is equal to P1, right? So he's charging a price P1 which is higher than P star. Now the question is what happens immediately? Now always remember that there are two assumptions in this market, in the definition of this market, and that is the assumption of perfect information. So you can think about it, the moment he updates his price, the price of that seller gets updated and it gets sorted and goes right at the top, right? So let's say when you enter the market, there is a board which displays the prices set by the different sellers in that market, and right at the top, this purchaser is buying. This producer is actually charging a higher price, and his name goes right at the top. So you can look at this purchaser. This is the person who is charging a higher price compared to everyone else. That's one. So you get to see that. And the second is you know that the products are homogeneous in nature. Now, given these two information, no one will want to buy from this particular person or this particular seller, and his demand will fall down to 0. The demand for his goods, producers goods, falls down to 0. The demand goes down to 0, right? So that is one. Now let's take the second case. So here he is charging a price which is more than P star. Now, what he wants to do is he says no. What I'll do is I'll attract the people more by charging a lower price. So what he goes down and does is he charges the price P star which is greater than P1. So he charges the price P1, which is lower than P star actually. So now your let me put this as P2. Now P star minus epsilon is P2. P star minus epsilon is P2. Now the question is that when I am charging a price which is less than the market price, can I go ahead and can I take up the entire market? But no, my assumption over here is that but the market, perfectly competitive market, has in its place the assumption that there are a large number of buyers and sellers. So one single buyer or one single seller is actually selling a very small fraction of the overall supply. So even if he puts the price down and the entire market comes to him, he doesn't stand in a position to supply the entire market. He can only supply that share to which because his production is limited. So he is such a small participant in the larger market that he cannot uh, supply that. Now this is where, because he has a fixed cost structure, right, which cannot be changed immediately. So therefore, when I lay down the price, the demand may become infinite over here. Your demand becomes infinite, but the point is you are unable to supply the entire market. Your demand becomes infinite. So infinitely many people are willing to buy from you, but you cannot supply the entire output. Your supply capacity is limited. You supply a very small fraction of the overall market supply by influencing the price. I mean, uh, overall, you supply a very small fraction of the total market supply, right? So even if the demand is infinite, the supply that the firm does is limited. And now the question is that if the entire market comes to him and even his supply is limited, why is he not willing to charge the price lower than what he would then than what the market price is? Because even if he does that, he's unnecessarily foregoing revenue because he's unnecessarily charging a certain price because whatever his market share is would also have been there if his price was at P star. So his market share ultimately is not altered by P star by moving P star from moving from P star to P2. The supply is limited, hence market share is not impacted. So his market share does not increase in this particular case. Market share is not impacted. Is not impacted, right? Okay. So market supply is limited. The market share is not impacted. So therefore, the producer does not have an incentive to be here or does not have an incentive to be here. So ultimately, the producer's equilibrium is always to be at E star, right? So what it shows over here is that by deviation, the producer does not have any incentive to deviate given the action of the other players. So given what the other producers are doing, right? Given that what the other producers are doing, this producer is always best off charging a price of P star. Any temporary deviation does not give him an incentive, does not give him a greater payoff, and hence he would not have the incentive to deviate. That is why this equilibrium is called a Nash equilibrium. So what a Nash equilibrium ideally says is, it says that, and given that there are two players or there are two participants who are interacting among themselves, both of them will be at a Nash equilibrium if a temporary divergence does not give either of them a, a betterment of their payoff. So none of them by divergence from that particular strategy, the set of strategy that they are taking up. Over here is the prices. So over here, two players, P star charging prices P star, P star. Now one of them goes and charges a P star plus epsilon, and the other keeps on charging P star, the other has to come back to P star. On the other hand, if someone is charging, if all the producers are P star and one goes to charge a P star minus epsilon, then there will be an infinite increase in demand and they will be forced to come back to P star. So unilateral deviation does not give anyone a better set of payoffs. And when this condition happens, so basically, given the action of the other producers, I am best of what I am doing, and given my actions, they are best of. On the other hand, on the other hand, all the other given the other players, right? They are best of doing what I am doing, and I'm best of what they are doing. If any one of us diverges, right, that unilateral deviation is not going to give any one of us a better advantage, and hence there will be no incentive for unilateral deviation, right? So over here, what it clearly says is there is no incentive for unilateral deviation. So no incentive for unilateral deviation, and hence this is Nash equilibrium. This is called the Nash equilibrium. So the price is the fixed price which is charged by the market is an element of the fixed ladder. So basically there is no incentive for unilateral deviation, right? So this unilateral deviation, so this price which is charged by the perfectly competitive producer the perfectly competitive market is the Nash equilibrium, and to ensure that it's an equilibrium, the market characteristics has been designed, and that's why in the last class we said that a market is an institution which has a set of rules of transactions, and this set of rules of transaction ensures that the prices that you charge is always a Nash equilibrium, right? Clear up to this point? So just go through this for a minute and then we'll get started. Okay. So any questions up to this? Anything that you may not have understood? If you have any questions, you can either put it in the chat box or you can unmute yourself and ask. Perfect. Now, given this Nash, given that the P star is the Nash, we come to the next process, the next question of the equilibrium. This equilibrium that we say the demand supply equilibrium, right? Now, different properties, right? So we need to talk about the stability of kind of getting, you would keep on getting seeing, you get to see different kind of demand and supply curves, right? Which we may not have kind of imagined in our wildest dreams. So we'll talk about them, right? But first, let's start off with the most conventional framework of demand and supply, right? And let's try to assess these curves: the demand curve, the supply curve, the equilibrium, the property of the equilibrium, and above all, the what are the, so how is it that if this equilibrium is moved out to someplace else, so does that come back? So is this equilibrium a unique equilibrium? Is it a stable equilibrium? So what are the properties and which would ensure each of these characteristics of the equilibrium? So when we talk about the general equilibrium framework, we get a bigger source, we have a bigger basis to say that. But over here, what we are trying to do is, over here we are trying to understand that how this thing, how this overall behavior. So we're trying to just have an idea about the concepts. We are not kind of delving deeper into them. So as we delve deeper into the consumer theory, the producer theory, and to the general equilibrium theory, so you will see, you'll get to you'll get a more in-depth understanding of that construct. But over here we are just trying to have a sneak peek or kind of a bird's eye view of these core concepts, right? So that we get familiarized to each of these things. So let's first of all, let's draw a very nice demand and supply curve, which we haven't done much till now. I'll use the demand curve in red and the supply curve in blue. And this is the typical point of equilibrium. You have Q star over here, and you have P star over here, and this is your equilibrium zero. Now, let's say I have obtained an equilibrium, right? But that equilibrium, just obtaining an equilibrium is no equilibrium until and unless it's sustainable, right? So there are three things which we need to ensure about an equilibrium or as a property that an equilibrium must have. Now, let's say, for example, so many of us who are working into the industry today, we try to find out a solution, right? We try to find out, let's say, we try to develop models. So we develop statistical models for some odd reasons. Now, we often say that developing a model is not only the important thing, but to ensure that that model can sustain over a period of time, or that I can actually sustain with the strategy that the model provides me with, is very important. So the concept of sustainability is very important as far as an equilibrium is concerned. So if you have a equilibrium E0, then what you need to ensure is that number one, so there are three characteristics that we generally ensure. Number one, that it is unique, that I have one single point of equilibrium so that I don't need to bother about multiple equilibriums. But there are cases when you have multiple equilibriums in an economy as well. So multiple equilibrium economy or disequilibrium economies or nonlinear equilibriums are also there, but we'll come to them at a later stage of our discussion, right? So over here, so the uniqueness of the equilibrium is something which is very important. The second the second thing that I need to ensure is that it has to be stable. So basically, if my system diverges away or someone pulls me away from that equilibrium, I must again work my way back to this equilibrium process, right? The third is it should be sustainable over time. So it should not be suddenly that one by modeling your supply curve becomes positively sloped and your negatively sloped and your demand curve becomes positively sloped and your equilibrium just goes for a toss. So the equilibrium that you develop should be a sustainable equilibrium. Should be a sustainable equilibrium. So these are the three properties as of now. Now there are there are a couple of more properties as well, which we'll talk about later in details. But let's try to forget that and let's try to just understand how is it that this is working. Now there are two things that one is uniqueness. Now what ensures uniqueness? It is the consumer's optimization and the producer's optimization methods, which decides on the uniqueness, or which ensures that the equilibrium that comes out is a unique equilibrium. So we'll come to that. We'll come to that in a little while. May not be today, but in tomorrow's discussion, we'll come to that. But as of today, just try to understand that you have these three properties. Now, how do I actually validate whether this system is, whether this equilibrium or this market structure that I have, that I'm looking over here, when my demand curve is negatively sloped, so it is negative, it has negative relationship with prices. So what it says is that as the prices increase, right, at the higher prices, the relative, the willingness of the borrower to pay gradually reduces. So basically, at higher prices, your willingness to buy gradually lowers, right? Because there are more and more number of people who are kind of moving out of that, and things are becoming more and more expensive. So as the prices increase, right, the supply curve is positively sloped. So the supply curve gets positively sloped, and that is one part of the slope. So one thing that you get to see very clearly in most of these cases is that so one of the important things that we need to keep in mind over here is that, as you know, we kind of go to work with these equilibrium, right? So we need to understand the reason behind each of these: uniqueness, stability, sustainability. But over here, as of now, we'll just talk about the concept of stability. We just try to assess whether the equilibrium is stable or not, and what is that factor which ensures that the so what is that factor which ensures that the equilibrium will be stable, right? Okay, now to answer this, one of the things that we get to see over here is, let's say the price increases by, or there is an event which suddenly causes the price to increase by some amount, and the price of the product rises from OP star to become OP1, right? So over here you have a disequilibrium. So over here your demand is here and your supply is here. So you are demanding 5 units, but the supplier has, let's say, 50 units, or let's say has 30 units in his inventory. So this is the part which will cause an inventory accumulation. This will cause an inventory accumulation. And this typical situation of inventory accumulation that you have is this typical inventory accumulation, that, and this typical case of inventory accumulation that you have is a typical result of the excess supply. Right. Right. Now, similarly, if the price of the product suddenly fell down, so this would create a, an excess demand. Now the question is that this system, now once you have done this, right? So we have so as I was saying, right? So this is a situation of an excess demand. Now the question is that does this situation have the capability to, once it's removed from this part, does this have the capability come back to this equilibrium position? So let's see how this adjustment would happen. So the first and the most important thing that we kind of look over here is that you have an excess demand, right? So and the producers are producing over here. So corresponding to this price, how much is it that the producers would want to produce? I mean, the demanders should have. So it should be something like this, right? So the system moves from this path to it moves to this path. Now this excess demand is there, right? To produce this, so if this is being produced, right, at this price, right, they are trying to have some kind of, so the corresponding supply or the demand that you should have over here is this part. Now if this is the demand, right, so this should be the and this is the corresponding supply over here at this price. So one thing you can see is that the price has kind of swung from being a excess demand, excess supply to an excess demand. But again, this is not the case. Now this excess demand will tend to cause the price to tend to push the prices up. So corresponding to this supply, the corresponding demand over here should have been this. Now if this is the demand at this, now see the prices have kind of gone down over here at this. So the demand price is something which is lower than P1. And then what happens over here is this is the corresponding supply at that price. Now, if this is the supply, this is what the demand is expected to be. Now, at this price, at this price, this is what the supply shall be. And then this is what the demand shall be. Again, the same thing, and gradually it kind of converges to this. So this is the process through which it adjusts the price. So you have a situation supply, demand, excess supply, demand, excess supply, excess demand. And that entire thing kind of helps you go back to this equilibrium position. So one thing you can see is that if there is an excess supply, right, an increase in the price of the product will cause, so if there's an excess demand in the industry, if there's an excess demand which exists, as the price of the product would rise, that excess demand will gradually wipe out or will get wiped out, right? So over here, So this excess, so this relationship that you can see that this converges back to the equilibrium. The process through which this converges is through an adjustment of the excess demand. So as the prices change, so you can see that at this higher price, so as the prices are increased from P2 to this price, you can see that the excess demand has reduced. Over here, as you move, you see the excess demand has reduced. So as you come, it is there. So it comes into this particular equilibrium, right? So this is one of the questions that we have. Now, this process through which it adjusts, right? So one thing that you can clearly see is that there is an inverse relationship which is there between the excess demand, the price, and the changes in price. So it says that the excess demand is related to the negatively related to the prices. And this process and the process that is generated through this adjustment is called your tannonement process. We write it as the tannonement process, but it's pronunciated as the tannonement process. The no process. The tannonement process. Right? So over here, one thing that you can clearly see is that as the prices would adjust, right? So as the so excess demand, so the very fundamental of this stability of the equilibrium is the fact that the excess demand is negatively related to the prices, and hence your prices equilibrates back. Now, if this condition was not existent and that excess demand, as prices increase, as the excess demand had increased, this equation would have been an explosive equilibrium rather than and a explosive divergent equilibrium rather than being a convergent equilibrium, right? So this negative relationship between the excess demand and the prices, right? So this generates the result called the tannonement process, and this is a very typical Walrasian feature. So this is known as the Walrus law. So one of the so this is one of the crux of the Walrasian equilibrium. Now this framework of this equilibrium is an Walrasian equilibrium because over here you saw whatever adjustment that happened through the quantities. So whenever adjustments happen through the quantities or through an adjustment of the quantities, we say that it's a Walrasian equilibrium. If prices were kind of adjusting, it would have been a Marshallian adjustment. But the adjustment process that we generally talk about or that we generally have with us are the Walrasian adjustments. So I'll talk about this difference between Walrasian and the Marshallian adjustments a little later, maybe in tomorrow's discussion. But let's for the time being, let's just focus on this equilibrium process, the way this equilibrium is kind of attained, right? So this is how the stability of the equilibrium is attained. And given these assumptions are in place, then given these relationships are in place between the consumer producers and the perfect competitive institution, right? This equilibrium is sustainable over infinite point of time. So if at each point of time, if you replicate it, you can kind of do it. But one thing is that this exercise is not a dynamic exercise. This is a static exercise. So you are conducting this exercise at one instant of time. And if I say that you are replicating this at each instant of time, right, over a period of time, and you want to see how it happens, then you can think about it as a couple of partial static snapshots giving you a dynamic picture, but that's not the complete picture. Dynamic optimization and the dynamic market equilibrium is a different ball game altogether. So we'll talk about that much later, not right now. But over here, we are just talking about the simple static framework at a given point of time. and this adjustment happens. Now you would ask that if it is adjusting, there is a time involved. So and why are we saying that it happens at an instant of time then? We are saying that it happens at an instant of time because of two reasons. Number one, the economic agents have been believed to be indefinitely rational, right? So changes will happen instantaneously with them. And the second explanation, the more realistic explanation, is that when we say an instant of time, we are taking a larger instant of time and allowing this to happen within that time frame. Let's say within a day, within a few hours, right? You will see that this adjustment happening. If you go to the vegetable markets, right, from the morning of 8 to 12, you'll see this adjustment happening, and at the end of 12 or 1 p.m., you end up with an excess supply which is sold at a lower price, and that equilibrates to the price which was there in the morning. So that happens during those 4 hours. So for us, the instant of time is those 4 hours of that entire day. So that way we call it. But if you are looking at dynamic framework, it would be that time period for today plus time period tomorrow, then day after tomorrow, and over a period of year, right? So basically, we are talking about this as a static exercise, right? And this static exercise actually enables us to understand, or the static exercise would help us explain the key features of an equilibrium, right? So till now, what we have seen is what is demand curve, what is supply curve, right? What do they imply? And we have also talked about uh, the concept of the inverse demand curve. And if you see the way I have plotted the inverse demand curve, I have kind of plotted there's a function, the price is a function of the quantity. So therefore, this demand curve that I have plotted is in Walrasian demand curve. We'll talk about Walrasian and Marshall shortly when I talk about the fundamentals of consumer optimization and producer optimization, and what is it that makes the demand curve negatively sloped, and what is it that makes the supply curve positively sloped, is the part where we talk about the micro foundations of these demand and supply curves, right? So that will be one of the discussions that we would have very shortly, right? So these are some of the important characteristics that this equilibrium has, or these are some of the important characteristics, or you can say some of the important conditions which has been built into the system so that this equilibrium comes out. And this framework is a typical neoclassical framework, right? Now, when I say a neoclassical framework, what do I mean? When I say a classical framework, what do I mean? So there has been a whole evolution of economics over the last 350, 400 years. So we'll talk about them as well over a period of time. But as of now, the most prevalent structure of economic analysis which is carried on is the neoclassical framework, right? So any questions up to this point? Okay, so Debolina has a question. There's a synonym that you use for the walrus law. Can you please elaborate on that? Uh, what synonym do I use, Debolina? It's the walrusian law the walrus law that I said, right? No, it's not the walrus law. So the fact that the excess demand is negatively related to the prices, it's not the walrus law. The walrus law is something different. So it is this criteria which ensures that the equilibrium actually occurs, and the process through which it happens, the cobweb process that is typically called, is known as the Tatanma process. That's called the Tatanma process. So it's not the alternate for walrus law. Walrus law is walrus law, right? So so it says that P dot EDP is equal to 0. So if you are so basically if you are to be an equilibrium, so if your excess demand rises, your prices must go down such that that equilibrium is always so that equilibrium is maintained, right? So that's the walrus law. Now the Tatanma process is that cobweb process that we generally call. Now this process is called a cobweb process because you can see that this is kind of uh, it looks more like a cobweb, the web of a spider, right? And it kind of converges in. Now there are different ways to kind of assess this particular process. There are different so you can actually set up a proper quantitative model to study the properties of this Tadanma process. We will be doing it at a later part. I don't want to make it too quantitative at this point of time because we are kind of also because I wanted to be in a kind of storytelling mode at this point. But as we proceed, so once the structure is created and is clear in our minds, then we'll start talking about what so how is it that these things or how is it that it can be evaluated and and how is it assessed in a quantitative framework and so on. Now the next question from here that we go into is the consumer's optimization and the producer's optimization process. Now the question is that a demand curve is negatively sloped, the supply curve is positively sloped. Very good, I'm getting an excess demand is related to price, the thermal process operates, I reach to an equilibrium. But my fundamental question is, how do I get? Right, so how do I get that? So the question is that how do I kind of get to that, and how is it that this particular thing is. So how is okay. So as I was saying, then how do I know that that the demand curve is negatively sloped? How do I know that the supply curve is positively sloped? And how do I know that the equilibrium exists there? What are the frameworks? How do I model those independent behaviors? So the demand curve is very sure it comes from the consumer's optimization process, and the supply curve we are very sure comes from the producer's optimization process, right? So now what we are going to do is are kind of going to bring in each of these manners. So we are going to explore each of these behavioral frameworks. So this is not the full-fledged consumer behavioral model that we are going to talk about. We're just going to talk about a very simple Marshallian framework, right? The Marshallian framework, and from there we'll see how the demand curve is created. The bigger picture of the consumer behavior theory, the one which has been proposed by Hicks and Allen, and we call the typical neoclassical consumer behavior theory, the one that we study with budget line and indifference curve, is something that we will talk about in a as a separate space. So over here, let's try to understand how this consumer optimization happens. How is it? How does it get converted to the demand curve? How does the producer optimization happen, and how does it get converted to the supply curve? So these are the two things that we'll talk about, and what happens exactly at the point when the equilibrium is arrived, and if it deviates from the equilibrium, what is it that is actually happening? Right. Okay. So over here, let's say, so let's start off with the consumer's optimization process. The consumer's optimization process. And on the other hand, we also have the producer's optimization process. Now coming to the consumer's optimization process. Talking to the consumer's optimization, what is it that the consumer tries to optimize, or what is it that they are trying to maximize? They are trying to maximize their utility. Their utility. So they are trying to maximize their utility. You have a utility maximization. Utility maximization, right? Now, when we talk about utility maximization, so the question that comes out is that what is utility? So obviously, utility is nothing but the satisfaction from consumption. Now, this is where the beauty of this subject lies. The satisfaction from consumption is purely an abstract behavior. The satisfaction from consumption. Now, when we talk about satisfaction from consumption, satisfaction is purely you know, it's purely a subjective behavior. Now, the beauty of the subject lies in the fact so the beauty of the subject lies in the fact that able to it has been able to you know quantify or create a mathematical form to the subjective behavior. Now the question that again comes out over here is that how do I quantify the satisfaction? But before we go into talk about this Marshallian and consumer optimization, let us try to understand from where did this problem actually come, or from where did this consumer optimization problem and this formalization come in, because it never existed historically, right? Now this basic consumer optimization model, the first ever proper formulation of a consumer optimization model, is is accredited to Professor Marshall, right? I think Alfred Marshall, right? So that's what his name was. And since then, one of the major strands of economic thought has been the Marshallian thought, right? The Professor Alfred Marshall was a part of the classical school of economic thought, which was pioneered by Adam Smith. You had Adam Smith, you had David Ricardo, you had Alfred Marshall, and many of those economists of those Igu and all those and all those economists of those times who actually pioneered that school of thought. And Professor Marshall actually provided the first ever formalization of the consumer's behavior, right? And explained the construction of the demand curve. Before that, it was intuitively described by Adam Smith to be negatively sloping, and he had used his pure intuition and introspective assumptions to reach to the conclusion. But how is it that you would derive the demand curve from a consumer's behavior directly is something which he had not said. So one of the founding works of consumer behavior theory has been done by Professor Alfred Marshall. And hence this school of thought is always known as the Marshallian school of thought. The Marshallian theory. The Marshallian theory of I have the consumer optimization, utility maximization, and so on. Now, one of the questions that comes out over here is so I have the Marshallian theory of demand, right? Now, before we go to talk about that, let's try to think about the fact that economics before Professor Marshall was there for 300 more than 300 years then, or more than 200 years. The question is, why was it that such a theory was not developed before? So, how did this entire economic genre evolve? The most earliest form of economic theorization that we find out is never found under the subject called economics. Economics was never studied as a separate discipline before 1776. So before the publication of the Consequence of the Wealth of the Nations. So economics was a part of political science, it was a part of history, and it was studied like that. So it was never a separate discipline like that. So if we look at the entire evolution of economics, so one of the major factors which had engineered the, you know, the uh, engineered the growth of economics at a point of time was the Industrial Revolution. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, if you think about the medieval European periods, right? The medieval European periods, you had these people. So Europe was kind of infested with wars, and to finance those wars, they needed gold. So therefore, there was a very prevalent thought of economic, prevalent school of economic thought who strongly said that as an economy, you should never indulge into importing goods and services. They actually deplete your gold reserves. You should import, you should do everything within the economy, and only thing that you should indulge in trade is to export because that brings in gold, and you can actually use that gold to finance a whole lot of other activities, right? So the gold reserves was a very strong point or strong thing to reckon at in those days of economic analysis, and in those days of you know in those days of the behaviors. So in those days of economic beliefs, but then something happened in Europe, which we call the Industrial Revolution, and goods started getting produced under such a massive scale that even after feeding the catering to the endogenous demand, you had a whole lot of excess goods which were kind of created. Now, either those goods get spoiled and the resources are lost, or you make out a vent for these, or make out a way to find out a market for these goods. So that is where Adam Smith's basic theory of the vent for surplus theory comes in, where Adam Smith tells that, hey, look, if you are kind of putting this in stock and goes on over time, after a point of time, there will be a huge accumulation of these goods and there would be no one to buy it. So it would either mean that our goods are lost or it's wasted, or what happens is you kind of operate your farms at a half a capacity, and under both the cases, you'll not be able to grow as much. So why don't we kind of export these goods to the other world, to the Eastern world, and get goods from them as well? So why don't we indulge into trade? And that's where Adam Smith formally coined economic transaction or economic transactions to take place, and that's where he first studied the way a transaction between two countries can take place. And that's where he started laying down the basic foundations of the uh, the theory of labor, the specialization, the theory of specialization and division of labor theory, that labor should be perfectly divisible. So labor should be more or less homogeneous. And how is it that you can make labor homogeneous? You should constant trial and practice. So one set of labor has to perform one set of activities over a long period of time. And that's what today's business processes are all about. So when we work in the industry, we talk about setting up processes, protocols, SOPs, uh, checkpoints, and everything. Why do we do that? So that when an experienced guy leaves the organization and a new person comes in, it takes a minimum time to upscale him to that process, and he can do that, and after a point he becomes a homogeneous labor. So all the labor are homogeneous. Now think about people in your organization who are doing reporting stuffs. They're all homogeneous individuals, right? So if one goes out, the other will come in, and you have a whole set of automated processes through which he runs the codes, he gets the output, puts it into Excel, presents it. Now the minor differences in terms of homogeneity that would come in is in terms of his interpretation of the numbers, for which there is a layered review control, which will ultimately get the output to a standard what was produced by a more so-called more talented resource. So both of them, the output produced by them, are ultimately turning out to be homogeneous, right? So this is something that we want to understand. This is something that should be kind of taken into account, right? So this was the division of labor and specialization of labor that was put in by Adam Smith, and is even practiced by the major corporates today. So you see that all your team sits in one single place, and there's an information bar, and you're not allowed to access the other floors, because what Adam Smith believed was that there should be a set of laborers must be specialized in a separate task. So basically, let's say someone like someone who is working into model development, right, or who is working into marketing, is experienced in marketing, and he does only marketing. He doesn't look into audit, finance, and sales. For someone, let's say, who is doing a model development, statistical model development for the banks, for the businesses, they are only focused into development. They don't take care of monitoring and monitoring and validation and blah and blah and so on things. So if you are a model developer, just focus on model development, you will kind of reduce your errors over a period of time. You specialize in that. So your skill has to be highly specialized. So, and it has to be highly process oriented, such that the labor are, or each of the labors become homogeneous as far as the delivery of that work is concerned. So if you see that the businesses are constantly striving to make the labor homogeneous. So even though we tend to make fun of these assumptions, homogeneous labor, transaction cost, but today today's world, they have actually become a reality. So Adam Smith's theory was something which was way ahead of its time. So where he said that labor has to be made homogeneous, and he laid down the guidelines, the, the crude guidelines as to how to make that. That has been finessed by the corporates and the bigger organizations today. So in your organization, when you work, we'll see that there's a whole set of process guidelines laid down, process manuals laid down for you to refer to them and kind of replicate the process. So more or less, you're always replicating a set of analyses rather than doing something new of your own. The moment you do something new away from the protocol, your business comes back to you and tells, no, this is something we haven't seen. We don't know that. We need to get it reviewed and we need to make it a part of the process. So there's a whole set of approval process that you need to go through to induct that new innovation into the existing control until it becomes a process. So, and the reason why you are not made to do that is because that will hamper the process, the homogeneity of the output. So they are always striving to get, why is automation such a big issue today? So that the output becomes homogeneous. So the minor quality differences between the workers are not impacting the final output too much. So that makes output insensitive to changes in quality. In a way, it makes your labor homogeneous in nature. So at each stage, right? So those foundations that Adam Smith had laid down in his consequences of the state of the wealth of nations is something where which is kind of reality today. So Adam Smith theory speaks of homogeneous goods. So we do use homogeneous goods today, right? So we do have these uh, oil, and we have all these. So basically, think about a rice or a paddy which has been produced, right? So they are homogeneous goods. So think about assumptions of the zero transaction cost, so zero transportation cost. So today things happen at the click of a button. So your transportation cost is actually zero, right? In making a transfer, in doing a business decision, so things happen at a click of a button. So what we generally tend to see is that, so what I'm trying to tell you is that those concepts which was envisaged by Adam Smith at this point of time was actually way ahead of his times, right? But those had laid down the basic fundamentals of economics. So whatever is not there in the consequences of the wealth of investigation into the consequences and causes of the wealth of nations, or as we call it, the wealth of nations, right? Whatever is not there is not there in economics. So many advances have come about in economics, but the basic principles on which the subject still stands today is the wealth of nations. And that is why we say that Adam Smith is considered to be the father of economics. So Adam Smith is not actually considered to be the father of economics, but he's actually considered to be the father of modern day economics, right? And from there, the evolution of economics as a separate discipline began. People started realizing that no, I cannot study this with, oh, as a part of political science, a part of history, a part of social sciences. It has to have a separate place in the social science and a separate discipline in the social science. And from there onwards, it actually started beginning there. And then Adam Smith's work was taken forward by uh, so his able student Marshall, and then you had Ricardo. Then and Ricardo had mostly specialized on trade. Marshall was someone who was more interested in studying the human the behavior of the economic agents, right? So he was more of a micro kind of a driven guy. Then you had people talking about international trade, and then you had obviously the classicals talking about macroeconomics. You had the Say's law, you have the classical demand supply graph, and you have the whole set of classical economics. And that book of 1776, Wealth of Nations, laid down the framework that the world was to follow for the next 300 years. So and for the next 200, 250 years, until 1929, in 1929, the world enters into one of its greatest depression, and from where you have one of the biggest structural break coming in economic thought, which is your Keynesian thoughts, your Keynesian economics. So Keynesian economics was mostly if we start over a macro strand, it did not have too much of a micro foundation to that macro behavior. Excuse me. Right, it did not have that flavor to micro to this. You don't have the micro foundation to the macro behavior. Post which a new evolution happened, which we talk about as the new Keynesian thought, where the micro foundations to this macro theory was built. Right. So you have the classical economic thought, and within that you have another small revolution. You have a big revolution which is called the neoclassical thought. So the neoclassical thought. Okay. Fine. Yes, we have the neoclassical economic thought, and from there, the next thing that we have is the Keynesian economics. So this is how the economics had kind of moved from one stage to the other. This is how it evolved. And while we study the microeconomic strand of economic thought, Professor Marshall's work is going to be one of the key foundations of our analysis. Right? So let's take a pause here for the day. I think we're already running out of time. We have very little time left. So let's start off with the micro foundations of this theory. So from the consumer behavior foundation, the producer behavior foundation, from this theory, and then from there let's start taking things up. Right? So one thing, all your recordings are available in the YouTube channel, right? The link I have shared it out with you. So please do go to the YouTube channel, get access to your recordings. You can download the recordings obviously, as well as you can view it from there also. So it's there and it's absolutely open. Do like, share, and subscribe to the platform. And thanks a lot for being a part of these sessions. Thanks a lot. Let's catch up tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.